The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the endless expanse of desert as Thomas McKenna guided his horse along the familiar trail back to his ranch. It was late September 1882, and the afternoon heat still clung to the red rocks and sparse vegetation like a stubborn fever. Thomas pulled his weathered hat lower, squinting against the glare as his mare, Buttercup, picked her way carefully through the rocky terrain. He'd been checking on his cattle near Willow Creek, finding 3 strays that had wandered too far from the herd. It was honest work, the kind that kept a man's hands rough and his conscience clear. At 34, Thomas had built a modest but respectable ranch 15 miles outside of Tucson, far enough from town to avoid its troubles, but close enough to trade when needed. "Easy there, girl," he murmured as Buttercup snorted nervously, her ears swiveling forward. Thomas knew his horse well enough to trust her instincts. In 8 years together, she'd warned him of rattlesnakes, coyotes, and even a mountain lion once. He reined her to a stop, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip. That's when he saw her god at first. Thomas thought it was a bundle of clothing someone had discarded. But as Buttercup reluctantly moved closer, he realized with a jolt that it was a woman lying motionless in the meager shade of a mesquite bush. Her dress, once fine blue cotton, was torn and dusty, and her auburn hair spread across the sand like spilled whiskey. "Lord Almighty," Thomas breathed, dismounting. Quickly, he approached cautiously, half expecting this to be some kind of trap. But as he knelt beside her, he could see she was in no condition to harm anyone. Her face was burned by the sun, lips cracked and bleeding. When he gently touched her shoulder, her skin felt like hot leather. She didn't stir. "Ma'am?" He shook her lightly. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" A faint moan escaped her lips, barely audible. She was alive, but just barely. Thomas didn't waste time pondering how she'd gotten there. He scooped her up, surprised by how light she felt, and carried her to Buttercup. The mare danced sideways, unsettled by the strange burden. "Steady now," Thomas soothed, managing to drape the woman across the saddle. He'd have to walk alongside, leading Buttercup home. It would take over 2 hours in this heat, but there was no other choice, Dot, as they made their slow journey. Thomas found himself glancing at the woman's face. Even beneath the sunburn and dust, he could tell she'd been beautiful. Her features were refined, delicate even, not the weathered look of frontier women. Her hands, when he'd lifted her, had been soft despite their current state. This was no farmer's wife or saloon girl. "Who are you?" he muttered, more to himself than to her unconscious form. "And what in God's name were you doing out here alone?" The sun was beginning its descent when Thomas finally spotted his ranch. The modest wooden house with its wraparound porch had never looked so welcoming. His ranch hand, Miguel Hernandez, came running from the barn. "Senator McKenna, que paso?" Miguel's eyes widened at the sight of the woman. "Found her out near Devil's Rock," Thomas explained, carefully lifting her down. "She's in a bad way. Ride to town and fetch Doc Holbrook. Tell him it's urgent. See Senator right away." Miguel was already heading for his horse. "And Miguel," Thomas called after him, "don't mention this to anyone else." "Not yet." Miguel nodded understanding and galloped off in a cloud of dust. Thomas carried the woman inside, laying her gently on the bed in his spare room. His sister Margaret had stayed here last Christmas, and the room still held a faint scent of her. Lavender soap. He fetched cool water and clean cloths, doing his best to clean the woman's face and hands. Her breathing was shallow, but steady. As he worked, he noticed things. A pale band of skin on her ringed finger where a wedding band should have been. Bruises on her wrists that looked suspiciously like rope marks. A small scar near her left temple, old but precise, as if made by a blade. "What happened to you?" He wondered aloud. He was attempting to give her small sips of water when her eyes suddenly fluttered open. They were the most striking green he'd ever seen, like spring grass after rain. For a moment they stared at each other, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest. "Don't single quotes T dot dot double quotes," she whispered, her voice like sand on wood. "Don't let them dot dot dot." "She," Thomas said gently. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." Her eyes filled with tears before closing again. She slipped back into unconsciousness, but her hand had somehow found his, gripping it with surprising strength. Doc Holbrook arrived just after sunset, his medical bag in one hand and his perpetual flask in the other. He was a competent physician, despite his fondness for whiskey, and Thomas trusted him. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," the doctor muttered, examining the woman. "How long was she out there?" "No idea," Thomas admitted. "Found her this afternoon, but she could have been there since morning. Maybe longer." Doc Holbrook worked for nearly an hour, cleaning wounds, applying salves, and forcing water mixed with laudanum between her lips. "She's severely dehydrated and suffering from heat exposure," he finally announced. "The next 24 hours will be critical. If the fever breaks, she might pull through. If not, he didn't need to finish. Thomas had seen enough death on the frontier to understand. "There's something else," Doc Holbrook said quietly, glancing at the door to ensure they were alone. "Those marks on her wrists, the bruising on her arms. This woman was held against her will recently." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Bandits, maybe, or worse." The doctor packed his bag. "I'll come back tomorrow afternoon. Keep her cool. Try to get water into her every hour. And Thomas?" He paused at the door. "Be careful. Women like this don't end up in the desert by accident. Someone might come looking for her." After the doctor left, Thomas sat in the chair beside the bed, studying the mysterious woman's face in the lamplight. He'd built his life on staying out of other people's troubles. It was how a man survived out here. But looking at her now, something told him his days of simple living were about to end around midnight. She stirred again. This time when her eyes opened, they seemed more focused. "Water," she whispered. Thomas helped her drink, supporting her. "Head carefully. Easy now. Small sips." "Thank you," she managed after drinking. Her accent was educated, Eastern maybe. "Where?" "You're at the McKenna Ranch, about 15 miles from Tucson. I found you in the desert." He set the cup aside. "What's your name?" She was quiet so long, he thought she drifted off again. Then, so softly, he almost missed it. "Eleanor. Eleanor Whitman." "Well, Miss Whitman, you're safe now. Rest." "Mrs." She corrected faintly. "It's Mrs. Whitman, or it was." A bitter smile touched her cracked lips. "He's dead now." "I made sure of that." Before Thomas could respond, she was unconscious again, leaving him with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that harboring Eleanor Whitman was going to be the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. The desert wind howled outside, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers trying to get in. Thomas added more wood to the stove and settled back in his chair. He'd keep watch tonight. Something told him Eleanor Whitman's past wasn't done with her yet, and when it came calling, he'd be ready. As the hours crawled by, Thomas found himself studying her face, wondering what could drive a refined woman like this to the edge of death in the Arizona desert. What was she running from? Or perhaps more importantly, who? The answer would come soon enough. For now, all he could do was wait and watch, a guardian angel in dust-covered boots, protecting a woman whose secrets might just get them both killed. The morning sun painted golden stripes across the wooden floor when Eleanor Whitman finally woke with true consciousness. For 3 days, she drifted in and out of fevered dreams, sometimes crying out names Thomas didn't recognize, sometimes speaking in languages he couldn't understand. But now, as he entered with a tray of broth and bread, he found her propped against the pillows, those remarkable green eyes clear and alert. "Good morning," Thomas said, setting the tray on the bedside table. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been dragged behind a horse through the desert," she replied, her voice still hoarse but stronger. "Which, I suppose, isn't far from the truth." Thomas was struck again by her cultured accent, the way she pronounced each word with careful precision. This was no ordinary frontier woman. "You've been very ill," he said, pulling up the chair he'd practically lived in for the past 3 days. "Doc Holbrook says you're lucky to be alive." Eleanor's fingers unconsciously went to her wrists, now bandaged where the rope marks had been. "Yes," she said quietly. "Lucky." Thomas ladled some broth into a bowl. "Think you can manage some food?" She nodded, accepting the bowl with hands that trembled only slightly. As she ate, Thomas noticed how she kept glancing toward the window, as if expecting to see someone there. "No one knows you're here except my ranch hand Miguel and Doc Holbrook," he assured her, "and they're both trustworthy men." Eleanor set down the spoon, meeting his gaze directly. "Mr. McKenna, I owe you my life, but I should leave as soon as I'm able. My presence here puts you in danger." "From whom?" She was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. "My late husband had business partners. Dangerous men who believe I have something that belongs to them." "And do." "You?" A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "In a way. I have knowledge they'd kill to keep secret." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her. In his years on the frontier, he'd learned to read people quickly. It could mean the difference between life and death. Eleanor Whitman was scared. That much was obvious. But there was steel beneath that refined exterior, a determination that intrigued him. "Why don't you start from the beginning?" he suggested. Eleanor took a sip of water, gathering her thoughts. "My husband was Charles Whitman. Perhaps you've heard of him?" Thomas shook his head. He owned several mining operations throughout Arizona and New Mexico. Silver, mostly, some copper. To the world, he was a successful businessman, a pillar of society. Her voice turned bitter. In reality, he was a monster who used his mines to launder money for even worse men. "What kind of men?" "A kind who sell guns to both sides of the border conflicts, who traffic in human misery." Her hands clenched in her lap. "I discovered the truth 6 months ago when I overheard a meeting I wasn't supposed to. Charles had been using me, using our social connections in San Francisco and Denver to facilitate his crimes." She paused, lost in memory. Thomas waited patiently, sensing there was more. When I confronted him, he laughed, said I was his property, just like his mines, and I'd do as I was told or face the consequences. Eleanor's chin lifted defiantly. "I'm from Boston originally, Mr. McKenna. My father was a judge. I was raised to believe in justice, in right and wrong. I couldn't be party to such evil." "So you left him?" "I tried. He had me followed, brought back. That's when the real nightmare began." She unconsciously rubbed her wrists again. "He kept me locked in our house in Phoenix, told everyone I was ill, suffering from female hysteria. But I managed to get word to a federal marshal I'd met at a governor's ball. Marshal James Morrison." Thomas knew the name. Morrison was legendary. In the territory, incorruptible and fearless. "The marshal began investigating quietly," Eleanor continued. "I smuggled him documents when I could, evidence of Charles's crimes. We were building a case that would have brought down not just my husband, but his entire network. What happened? Someone betrayed us. The marshal was ambushed and killed 2 weeks ago. That same night, Charles came to my room, drunk and raging. He said I'd be joining the marshal soon. But first, his partners wanted to know exactly what. I'd told the authorities. Thomas felt a cold anger building in his chest. That's when he tied you up? Eleanor nodded. They were planning to take me to Mexico, the men who specialized in making people talk. But Charles made a mistake. He'd been drinking heavily, celebrating the marshal's death. When he came close to taunt me, I managed to grab the letter opener from his vest pocket. She met Thomas's eyes steadily. I'm not proud of what I did, Mr. McKenna, but it was him or me. When the servants found him the next morning, I was already gone. I took his horse and what money I could find and ran. How did you end up in the desert on foot? The horse threw me when we spooked a rattlesnake. I think I hit my head because I don't remember much after that. I just kept walking, knowing I had to get as far from Phoenix as possible. She laughed bitterly. I suppose I almost succeeded in escaping permanently. Thomas stood and walked to the window, processing everything. She'd told him. Outside, Miguel was working with one of the horses in the corral, the picture of peaceful ranch life. But he knew that peace was an illusion now. These partners of your husband's, he said finally. They'll come looking for you. Yes, and they'll kill anyone who helped you. Yes. Her voice was barely a whisper now. That's why I have to leave. You've done enough, more than enough. I won't have your death on my conscience, too. Thomas turned back to her, his decision made. My father fought in the war between the states, Mrs. Whitman. He used to say that a man who won't stand up to evil is no man at all. You'll stay here until you're fully recovered. Then we'll figure out what to do next. But no arguments. You're not strong enough to travel yet, and sending you out there alone would be the same as murder. He moved back to the chair. Besides, I've got some experience with men who think they're above the law. Haven't always been a rancher. Eleanor studied him with new interest. What were you before? That's a story for another day. Right now, you need rest. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing. You mentioned documents, evidence, against your husband's partners. Do you still have any of it? Eleanor's hand went to her bodice, where he now noticed an unusual thickness in the fabric. I sewed what I could into my corset. Lists of names, dates, transactions. Everything Marshal Morrison and I had gathered. Good. Keep them hidden for. Now, when you're stronger, we'll look at our options. As he left the room, Thomas's mind was already working. He'd need to increase security around the ranch, maybe hire a few extra hands he could trust. Men would come looking for Eleanor Whitman. That was certain. The question was when, and whether he'd be ready for them. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Thomas stood on his porch, rifle in hand. Miguel had noticed his increased vigilance. Trouble coming, Jefe? The older man asked. Maybe. Keep your eyes open, especially for strangers asking questions in town. See, Senator, the Senora, she brings this trouble? Thomas nodded. But she doesn't deserve what they do to her. Sometimes a man has to choose between what's safe and what's right. Miguel smiled, understanding. My Rosa, she always said you were a good man, Senator McKenna. Too good to live alone forever. This isn't about that, Thomas said quickly, but he could feel heat rising in his face. Of course not, Miguel agreed, but his smile widened. I'll tell the boys to keep watch. Anyone comes looking for a lost senora, we haven't seen nothing. As Miguel headed back to the bunkhouse, Thomas remained on the porch, watching the desert settle into darkness. Somewhere out there, dangerous men were looking for Eleanor Whitman. They'd follow her trail eventually, like wolves on the scent of blood, but they'd have to go through him first. And Thomas McKenna hadn't survived 10 years on the frontier by being easy to kill. Inside the house, Eleanor lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. For the first time since that terrible night in Phoenix, She felt something besides fear and desperation. This rough rancher with his quiet strength and unexpected kindness had given her more than shelter. He'd given her hope. She touched the documents hidden in her corset. Marshal Morrison had died, trying to bring justice to the territory. She wouldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. And now she had an ally, even if he didn't fully understand yet what he'd gotten himself into. The wind picked up outside, carrying the scent of rain. A storm was coming, in more ways than one. Eleanor closed her eyes and let sleep take her, knowing that for tonight at least, she was safe. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for now, in this simple ranch house in the middle of nowhere, she'd found an unexpected sanctuary and a protector unlike any she'd ever known. 2 weeks had passed since Thomas found Eleanor in the desert, and the McKenna ranch had settled into a new rhythm. Eleanor, now strong enough to move about, had taken to helping with household tasks despite Thomas's protests. He'd find her in the kitchen, teaching Miguel's wife, Rosa, recipes from back east, or on the porch, mending clothes with precise, delicate stitches. "You don't have to earn your keep," Thomas told her one morning, finding her collecting eggs from the henhouse. "You're a guest here." "I've never been one for sitting idle, Mr. McKenna," she replied, placing another egg in her basket. "Besides, I find the work therapeutic." She wore one of Rosa's simpler dresses, her auburn hair pinned up modestly, but even in homespun cotton, there was an elegance about her that made Thomas's breath catch. He'd been trying to ignore the growing attraction, telling himself it was just natural concern for someone he'd saved. But watching her now, sunlight catching the copper threads in her hair, he knew he was lying to himself. "Thomas," he said suddenly. She looked up, confused. "I'm sorry?" "My name. You should call me Thomas. Mr. McKenna makes me feel like my father." A small smile played at her lips. "Very well. Thomas, and you must call me Eleanor. Mrs. Whitman belongs to a life I'm trying to leave behind." They stood there for a moment, the morning air crisp between them, something unspoken hanging in the balance. Then the sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. Thomas's hand went immediately to his gun. 3 riders were coming up the trail, too fast for a social call. "Get inside," he ordered Eleanor. "Now." To her credit, she didn't argue, moving quickly toward the house. Thomas watched the riders approach, recognizing none of them. They were hard-looking men, trail-worn and armed. The kind of men who made their living with guns. "Morning," the lead rider called out, reining up just outside comfortable shooting distance. He was tall and lean, with pale eyes that missed nothing. "Fine ranch you got here." "Appreciate the compliment," Thomas replied evenly. "Something I can help you gentlemen with?" "Maybe so." The man dismounted, his companions remaining in their saddles. "Name's Cole Hardin. We're looking for someone might have passed this way. A woman, red hair, fancy Eastern ways. Might be hurt or confused. Haven't seen anyone like that," Thomas lied smoothly. "Just me and my hands out here." Hardin's smile was cold. "That so? Mind if we water our horses? Been a long ride from Phoenix." Phoenix, so they were Charles Whitman's men, just as Eleanor had predicted. "Troughs over there," Thomas indicated with his chin, not moving his hand from his gun. "Help yourselves." As Hardin's men dismounted, Thomas caught movement from the Yosemite. Corner of his eye. Miguel and 2 other ranch hands had emerged from the barn, rifles in hand. Good men, loyal men, the odds had just improved. "Funny thing," Hardin said, letting his horse drink. "We tracked that woman to about 10 miles from here. Then the trail just disappeared, almost like someone picked her up. Deserts full of mysteries," Thomas replied. "Maybe the Apache got her. They've been active lately. Maybe." Hardin's eyes scanned the ranch house. "You live here alone? With my men?" No woman to cook and clean? Rosa comes up from Miguel's place when needed. Hardin nodded slowly, but Thomas could see he wasn't convinced. The gunman's eyes kept returning to the house, as if he could see through the walls. Well, Hardin said finally, if you do happen to see this woman, there's a reward. $500 for information leading to her safe return. Her family's worried sick. I'll keep that in mind. Hardin mounted his horse, but before turning to leave, he fixed Thomas with those pale eyes. Word of advice, friend. This woman, she's not what she seems. Killed her own husband in cold blood. Stole from him, too. Anyone helping her would be aiding a murderer and a thief. That's a hanging offense in these parts. Like I said, haven't seen her. Sure you haven't. Hardin touched the brim of his hat mockingly. We'll be in Tucson for a few days. If your memory improves, you can find us at the Silver Dollar. They rode off in a cloud of dust, but Thomas remained where he was, watching until they disappeared. Over the ridge. Only then did he allow himself to relax. Eleanor emerged from the house, her face pale but composed. They'll be back. Yes, I should leave tonight. I've brought enough trouble. We've been through this? Thomas cut her off. You're not going anywhere. Why? The word burst from her with unexpected force. Why are you risking everything for me? You don't even know me. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said, Maybe it's time I told you about my past. Come on, let's take a walk. They strolled toward the creek that bordered his property, the cottonwoods providing shade from the climbing sun. Thomas rarely talked about his life before ranching, but something about Eleanor made him want to share. 10 years ago, I wore a badge in Kansas, he began. Sheriff of a little town called Clearwater. Had a wife, too. Sarah. We were building a life, planning a family. Eleanor walked beside him silently, sensing the pain in his words. There was a rancher named Josiah Crane who pretty much owned the town. When homesteaders started moving in, claiming land Crane considered his, he hired gunmen to drive them off. When that didn't work, things got violent. Thomas picked up a stone and skipped it across the creek. I stood up to him, arrested his men when they burned out a family. Crane didn't take kindly to that. One night when I was out on patrol, his men came to my house. He didn't need to finish. Eleanor's hand found his arm, squeezing gently. After Sarah's funeral, I turned in my badge and left. Drifted south, ended up here. Told myself I was done with other people's fights. He looked at Eleanor directly. But when I found you in that desert, when I heard your story, I realized something. Running from doing what's right doesn't bring peace. It just brings a different kind of emptiness. Thomas, Eleanor said softly, I'm so sorry about your wife. But this is different. These men are no different from Josiah Crane. Men who think power gives them the right to destroy lives. His jaw set stubbornly. I didn't fight then when it mattered most. I won't make that mistake again. They stood by the creek, the water, gurgling peacefully, at odds with the tension in the air. Eleanor studied his profile, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not just a rancher who'd saved her life, but a man carrying his own burden of loss and regret. The documents I have, she said finally, they implicate powerful men. Railroad barons, territorial politicians, even a federal judge. If we could get them to the right authorities, we'd need to reach someone incorruptible, someone outside the territory maybe. There's a federal prosecutor in Denver, William Thornton. Marshal Morrison trusted him. Eleanor bit her lip thoughtfully. But getting to Denver means passing through too many towns where Charles's associates have influence. Then we don't go through towns, Thomas said. I know trails through the mountains, old Apache paths. It'll be rough, but it's possible. You'd do that? Leave your ranch? Risk everything? Thomas turned to face her fully. Eleanor. He stopped, struggling with words. These past 2 weeks, having you here, it's reminded me what it feels like to have something worth protecting again. The air between them charged with possibility. Eleanor's eyes searched his face, and what she found there made her breath quicken. Slowly, as if drawn by invisible strings, they moved closer. Thomas, she whispered, I'm not good for you. Everyone I care about gets hurt. Let me worry about that, he replied, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. Their lips had barely touched when the crack of a rifle shot split the air. Thomas threw Eleanor to the ground, covering her body with his, as another shot whistled overhead. The house! He shouted, helping her up. They ran, more shots following them. Spurts of dust marking where bullets struck. Miguel and the hands were returning fire from the barn, but Thomas could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 positions. Hardin had circled back with more men. They burst through the door, Thomas immediately grabbing his Winchester from above the fireplace. Stay down, he ordered Eleanor, who crouched below the window. Give us the woman, McKenna. Hardin's voice carried across the yard. No need for anyone else to die. Thomas answered with a rifle shot that sent Hardin diving for cover. The battle was on. For the next hour, gunfire erupted sporadically. Thomas had built his house solid, and the thick walls stopped most bullets. But he knew they couldn't hold out forever. Hardin had too many men. Thomas, Eleanor said during a lull, let me go. I won't have your death on my conscience. Not happening, he replied, reloading. Besides, I've got a plan. Before he could explain, Rosa burst through the back door. Center, riders coming from the south. Many riders. Thomas's heart sank. Reinforcements for Hardin. They were finished, but then he heard something that made him grin. A voice shouting orders. One he recognized. Hold your fire out there. This is Deputy U.S. Marshal Frank Cooper. Anyone still shooting after 10 seconds will be charged with attempted murder of a federal officer. Thomas had met Cooper years ago. In Kansas. A good man, straight as they came. But what was he doing here? The shooting stopped. Through the window, Thomas could see Hardin's men looking uncertain as a dozen riders wearing deputy marshal badges surrounded them. That's far enough, Marshal, Hardin called out. This is a private matter. Not anymore, Cooper replied. Cole. Hardin, you're under arrest for the murder of Marshal James Morrison and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Throw down your weapons. Now. For a moment, it looked like Hardin might fight. Then, seeing the odds, he slowly raised his hands. His men followed suit. Thomas emerged from the house, Eleanor behind him. Cooper, older and grayer than Thomas remembered, tipped his hat. Tom McKenna, been a while. Frank, your timing's impeccable. Got a wire from Doc Holbrook 2 days ago. Said you might need help. When I checked into who was asking about a red-haired woman, found out they were wanted men. Cooper's eyes moved to Eleanor. Mrs. Whitman? I was friends with Jim Morrison. He sent me copies of everything you gave him, just in case. We've been building a case, but we needed you alive to testify. Eleanor sagged with relief. It's over? Not quite. You'll need to come to Denver, make official statements. But with your testimony and the documents, we can bring down the whole ring. Cooper looked at Thomas. Appreciate you keeping her safe. Tom, Jim Morrison would have been grateful. As Cooper's men led Hardin away in shackles, Eleanor turned to Thomas. You could have been killed. Your ranch could have been destroyed. Worth it, Thomas said simply. I have to go to Denver, she said quietly. Testify, see this through. I know. Come with me. Thomas blinked in surprise. Eleanor, I have a ranch. To run. And when it's over? When justice is done? She stepped closer, her hand finding his. I'll have no reason to stay in Denver. but I might have a reason to come back to Arizona. Thomas squeezed her hand, feeling something he hadn't experienced in 10 years. Hope. Then I'll be waiting. They stood together, watching the sun begin its descent, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The danger had passed, but their story was far from over. It was, Thomas thought, just beginning. 6 months had passed since Eleanor Whitman had left the McKenna ranch for Denver, and Thomas had counted every day. He stood now on the same porch where he'd once watched for threats, but today he was watching for something else entirely, the dust cloud that would signal the approaching stagecoach. The ranch had prospered in her absence. With the reward money for helping capture Hardin's gang, Thomas had bought more cattle and hired additional hands. But success felt hollow without someone to share it with. He'd received letters from Eleanor, careful missives describing the trial proceedings, but between the formal words, he could read her longing to return. Still no sign, F.A.? Miguel asked, joining him on the porch. Stage isn't due for another hour, Thomas replied, trying not to sound anxious. Miguel smiled knowingly. Rosa has been cooking all morning. The whole house smells like a feast. No need to make a fuss, Thomas muttered, but he was grateful. Rosa had taken it upon herself to prepare for Eleanor's return as if royalty were arriving. He thought back to Eleanor's last letter, received 2 weeks ago. Dear Thomas, the trial concluded yesterday. 12 men convicted, including the federal judge. Charles's entire network has been dismantled. Marshal Morrison would have been pleased. I've settled Charles's estate, donated most to charity. I kept only what was rightfully mine from before. Our marriage. It's enough to start fresh wherever I choose. I find myself thinking of desert sunsets and a certain stubborn rancher who showed me that not all men are monsters. Some are heroes, even if they don't see themselves that way. I'll be taking the stage from Denver on the 15th. I hope the offer to wait still stands. With affection, Eleanor. With affection. Thomas had read those 2 words 100 times, wondering if they meant what he hoped they meant. Riders coming, Miguel announced suddenly. But not from town, from the north. Thomas tensed, hand moving to his gun out of habit. 3 riders were approaching, and as they drew closer, he recognized the lead figure, Frank Cooper. Marshal, Thomas greeted as Cooper dismounted. Wasn't expecting you. Tom. Cooper's weathered face was grave. I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Thomas's heart plummeted. Eleanor? She's fine, Cooper assured quickly. But there's been a development. One of Whitman's associates, Judge Harriman, escaped custody 2 days ago. He's made threats against Mrs. Whitman. Where is she now? That's just it. She left Denver 3 days ago, but not on the stage. She hired a private coach, said she wanted to surprise you. Cooper removed his hat, running a hand through his gray hair. We've been tracking her route, but lost the trail near Flagstaff. Thomas was already moving toward the barn. How many men does Harriman have? Unknown, but he's desperate and dangerous. Cooper followed him. I've got men searching, but I know where she is, Thomas interrupted, saddling Buttercup with practiced efficiency. There's only one route a private coach would take from Flagstaff to here, Eagle Pass. That's rough country. Exactly where? Harriman would plan an ambush. Thomas checked his ammunition. Miguel, gather the men. We ride in 5 minutes. Within minutes, Thomas led a group of 8 riders north, pushing their horses hard. Eagle Pass was a narrow canyon 30 miles away, the perfect place for an attack. If Eleanor's coach had left Flagstaff yesterday morning, she'd be reaching the pass right about now. They'd covered 20 miles when they heard it, the distant crack of gunfire echoing off canyon walls. Thomas spurred Buttercup harder, fear and determination warring in his chest. The scene they found was chaos. A fancy coach was overturned at the mouth of the canyon, its horses gone. 2 men in driver's livery lay still on the ground. Gunfire erupted from both sides. Attackers on the canyon rim, defenders behind the coach. "Eleanor!" Thomas shouted, but his voice was lost in the gunfight. "Half of you take the east rim," Cooper ordered his men. "Rest with me on the west." "Move!" Thomas didn't wait for tactics. He rode straight for the coach, Buttercup's hooves kicking up dust. A bullet whistled past his ear. Another struck his saddle horn, but he didn't slow Dot. He dove from his horse, rolling behind the coach, where he found Eleanor crouched with a derringer. In her hand, her traveling dress torn and dusty. An older man, obviously wounded, leaned against the wheel beside her. "Thomas!" Her face lit up despite the danger. "How did you—" "Later." He cut her off, assessing the situation. "How many?" "6, maybe 7, she replied. "All business. They killed our drivers immediately. Mr. Pemberton," she indicated the wounded man, "is my lawyer. He's hit in the shoulder." Thomas peered around the coach. Cooper's men were engaging the ambushers, evening the odds. "Can you ride? In this dress? Not well." He made a quick decision. "When I start shooting, you run for that rock outcropping. I'll cover you. What about Mr. Pemberton?" "I'll come back for him." Thomas met her eyes. "Trust me." She nodded without hesitation. "Always." Thomas rose, his rifle barking rapidly. Eleanor ran, the derringer still in her hand. An ambusher appeared on the rim, drawing a bead on her. Thomas's shot took him center mass before he could fire. Once Eleanor reached cover, Thomas hauled the wounded lawyer to safety, the man groaning with each movement. The tide was turning now, Cooper's men gaining the upper hand. Within minutes, the gunfire dwindled to nothing. Clear. Cooper called from the rim. 2 dead, 3 captured. Harriman's not among them. Thomas didn't care about Harriman just then. He was already moving toward Eleanor, who met him halfway. They collided in an embrace that said everything words couldn't. "You came for me," she whispered against his chest. "Always will," he replied, holding her tight. When they finally separated, Eleanor's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I couldn't wait for the stage. I needed to see you, to know if what I felt in your letters was real." And instead of answering, she kissed him. Not the tentative touch by the creek 6 months ago, but something sure and passionate, and full of promise. Thomas responded in kind, pouring months of longing into the moment. A throat clearing made them break apart. Cooper stood nearby, trying to hide a grin. "Hate to interrupt, but we should get moving. Harriman's still out there somewhere." They returned to the ranch as a convoy, the wounded lawyer in a commandeered wagon, with Rosa tending him. As they rode, Eleanor told Thomas about the trial, about facing the men who terrorized the territory, about finding her voice and her strength. "The prosecutor said I was the bravest woman he'd ever met," she said. "But he was wrong. I was terrified. Every moment, I just had something worth fighting for. Justice for Marshall Morrison? That too," she smiled. "But mostly the thought of coming back here. To you." That evening, with Pemberton resting comfortably and Cooper's men standing guard, Thomas and Eleanor finally had a moment alone. They sat on the porch swing, watching the sun paint the desert in familiar shades of gold and red. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said quietly, "about what comes next." Thomas's heart stuttered. "And I'm a wealthy widow now. I could live anywhere. San Francisco, Denver, even back in Boston." She turned to face him. "But none of those places have what I want." "What do you want?" "A stubborn rancher who saves mysterious women from the desert. Who stands up to dangerous men because it's right. Who makes me feel safe and cherished and alive." She took his hand. If he'll have me. Thomas lifted her hand to his lips. Eleanor Whitman, are you proposing to me? Someone has to, she replied with a smile. You're too proper to propose to a woman in mourning. Your mourning period ended the day Charles died. I mourned the man I thought I married years ago. Her expression grew serious. I know this is fast. I know people will talk. But Thomas, I've learned that life is uncertain. We have to seize happiness when we find it. Thomas stood, pulling her up with him. Then let me do this properly. He dropped to one knee, still holding her hand. Eleanor, you've brought light back into my life. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, she breathed. Yes. 1,000 times yes. He rose and kissed her as the last rays of sunlight faded behind the mountains. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the desert settled into peaceful evening. 2 weeks later, Judge Harriman was captured trying to flee to Mexico. With his arrest, the last of Charles Whitman's criminal empire crumbled. Eleanor testified one final time and closed that chapter of her life forever. She and Thomas were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Miguel and Rosa as witnesses and Frank Cooper giving the bride away. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress sent from Boston, but insisted on keeping the simple hairstyle she'd adopted at the ranch. I'm not that Boston society girl anymore, she told Rosa. I'm a rancher's wife now, and proud of it. As the months passed, the McKenna Ranch, now the McKenna-Whitman Ranch, became known as a place of refuge. Eleanor used her inheritance to help other women escaping dangerous situations, providing temporary shelter and fresh starts. Thomas supported her work, understanding better than most the importance of second chances. On their first anniversary, they stood again on the porch, Eleanor's hand resting on her growing belly. The desert stretched endlessly before them, golden in the afternoon light. Any regrets? Thomas asked, his hand covering hers. Only one, Eleanor replied. He looked at her in alarm, but she smiled. I regret it took so long to find you. Worth the wait? Worth everything, she confirmed, leaning into his embrace. In the corral, Buttercup whinnied, as if in agreement. Life on the frontier was never easy, but with the right partner, it could be wonderful. Eleanor had traveled far from her Boston, beginnings through tragedy and danger, to find her true home in the arms of a quiet rancher who'd shown her that love could bloom even in the harshest desert. As the sun set on another day in Arizona Territory, Thomas and Eleanor McKenna stood together, facing whatever the future might bring with the confidence of two souls who'd found their match. The desert had brought them together, tested them, and ultimately blessed their union. And in the vast, untamed beauty of the American frontier, they built a life founded on love, justice, and the courage to stand for what's right, a legacy that would endure long after the last sunset painted the desert gold.